Hello, welcome to this session, Bridging the Gap Between Developers and Designers. Before we start, I want to introduce Brooke and myself. Brooke Cronin is a UI and UX designer responsible for QDesign Studio. I am Thomas Hartmann, the lead developer of QDesign Studio. I will give a brief introduction about what QDesign Studio is, and after this, Brooke and myself will present a demo. The demo will showcase the designer-developer workflow, with me being the developer, starting in Qt Creator and C++, developing the backend, and then Brooke being the designer who will bring the UI of the application to life. In the end, I will integrate the resulting UI into the C++ application. In the end of the session, there will be time for questions and answers. What is QDesign Studio? QDesign Studio is a QML-based design tool for 2D and 3D content. It allows you to use the What You See is What You Get editor to design UIs in QML. QDesign Studio 2.1 comes with both a commercial version and a free community version. What can I do with QDesign Studio? As I already mentioned, QDesign Studio includes a What You See is What You Get editor for QML that allows designer to create beautiful UIs without having to manually write QML code by hand. It also allows you to create animations using our timeline, define UI logic with states and bindings, and to create custom controls just using the UI. The commercial version of QDesign Studio comes with the bridges that can import 2D-based designs from powerful UI design tools like Figma, Sketch, or Photoshop. This makes it really easy to import your assets. In the demo later, Brooke will show you how to use the Figma bridge. Last but not least, it is also possible to import assets from 3D tools like Maya, Blender, or even 3D Max into QDesign Studio. The resulting designs and assets will result in a QML application that you can actually deploy, run, and even profile. The first release of QDesign Studio came out in December 2018. And since then, we have continuously improved it. As you can see on this slide, we regularly released new updated versions, and the next release will be QDesign Studio 2.2 in September this year. QDesign Studio 2.1 was just released in April, and before I start with the demo, I want to give you an overview of the current feature set. QDesign Studio also contains a text editor that allows you to edit the QML code while staying in the What You See is What You Get tool. This is extremely useful to push the boundaries of QDesign Studio. Last year, we added a flow editor and a state transition editor. The flow editor allows you to define so-called flows between screens, and the state transition editor allows you to animate transitions between states in single screens. Since the first version of QDesign Studio, it has dynamic and scalable layouts, ready-made UI components, and timeline-based animations. You can also use effects, and the really powerful tool is the live preview, which allows you to run the application while live updating it when doing changes in the editor. You don't have to restart the application for this. Now I will start with a demo that shows how Brooke, in the role of a designer, and myself, in the role of a developer, can use QDesign Studio to collaborate while developing an application. Besides QDesign Studio, I will also use Qt Creator for the C++ parts. For this demo, we start with a C++ project. This project, its CMake base, was created with Qt Creator, and in parallel, I also created a QDesign Studio project and integrated it. You can see that I added the import paths. I added a few files here to the QRC file already that come from the QDesign Studio project. And besides that, I also defined a C++ backend object as a singleton. Here in the CMake txt file, I also defined the imports That's important so that the QML code model can pick up the imports when we want to use the QML editor. This is the header file from my C++ backend, and here you see that I expose 3 properties: percentage to run the gauge, a time, the state variable. And if you look at the implementation, then you see it's a really simple implementation. Nothing fancy, just a proof of concept kind of. I mean, of course, here we would have a real backend if this would be not just a demo. I can also open the QML file that I prepared in the integrated editor of Qt Creator. And you see that here that I bind the values from the backend object to a range mapper and then to an arc. Here's the import, and here and here you see the time bound to a text label, and on the bottom you will see the Boolean bound with when conditions to states. And in the form editor we don't have this available, it's not resolved, because this comes from C++ and the C++ backend is not executed in the form editor. But I can run the application, and this is now the C++ application compiled, and here you see the arc and the time moving, and the C++ backend is fully working here. So this is basically a real application kind of. Now I open the same QML file in QDesign Studio, but it's a different project, and this is also why we see something here. The QML file is exactly the same as I showed before, exactly the same QML file, but we see something here, and I will soon explain why. So let's have a look at the QML project file. So instead of the CMake file, we use a QML project file in this case. And here you see that I added what I call a mock import. So I added another import path, and this contains this backend object. And this has exactly the same API as my C++ backend, but it's done in QML, and it uses property animations to animate them a bit when I run the application. But this is pure QML, and that's executed inside QDesign Studio, and this is why you see something in the form editor. And of course, we can also run this. And you see it's a bit different. For example, the time in this case is not animated, but it's still running. And I can now hand this over to Brook, our designer, and he can now create the actual design for this application. He already has the API from what would later then come from C++. And after the handover, he can give me then back the full QML UI, and I can integrate it again in this C++ application. And then we have a better looking UI than what you see here. And Brook could even tweak the backend if he wants to have a slightly different behavior. But he can tell this himself. So now let's hand over to Brook.
Super, thanks, Thomas. So as you can see, I've now pulled down this project onto my own computer so that I can have a look and I can analyze some of the setup that Thomas has done here, make sure I understand the project structure and how I'm going to integrate my design. For the design files, I'm actually going to move over to Figma here. This is the bridge for Figma, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'll do another talk about the bridges in depth, but I just want to show you here. This is a basic componentization. I have a component here for my dial. The interior label and text for that I've done as a separate component because I might want to use that dial again in theory in another part of a project somewhere. So good componentization, keep the label separate, and I could reuse that dial for something else. And I already did a text override here, so Figma's going to generate that text override for me. And then finally, I've got this little icon, which I'm going to make a little rotation animation on, and the water level I'll do a little animation with as well. And then everything's instantiated into my project correctly, so I have instances of these components inside a sort of main screen file, which will give me the structure that I want to work with in Design Studio. Then I've just been through the file, labeled everything, named everything correctly, made sure all the settings are good for export. And as I say, we'll cover that in more detail in the next talk I do. So for now, this is fine. We can export this, bring it into Design Studio, connect it up with the prototype that Thomas has provided. So we just export the zip file here. We need to find that file, unzip it. And that's going to create a folder with all of our assets and the metadata file that we need. So some PNGs for everything that was rendered into PNG. The rest of the stuff will be SVG paths inside Design Studio and the metadata file itself that we will import. Okay, so we can come back. Just click on the asset, add asset button in the library here. And that will actually launch our importer. Once we've selected the metadata file here from this folder, we can just open that, load the importer here, leave everything as default, and import our Figma design directly into Design Studio. All right, and now we can actually go into the folder generated here. We can see that it's generated all the components and it's generated this main file where all of the components are instantiated. So this is the file we're going to use. But in order to actually kind of connect it to the back end and put some interaction on, we want to dive inside this component. So we'll just select this component here, go inside it. And what we should do first, you can see here the alias that was created by Figma for us already, so we don't even need to go in and create that alias for that text. We can bind the backend data directly to it, but what we need to do first is import the backend. And the easiest way to do that is just to type in the import statement here in the text file. And now we have access to all of the backend values that Thomas created for us. Then we can select the label, we can go to the alias property here, and we can create a binding to that backend value. So this one here will bind to the backend object.time value. And you see there it updates to the value created by Thomas in the backend. And once again, here's that binding that we're using. Okay, so this style is ready, but what we need to do now is add an arc element that animates. So we're going to need to bring in the Studio Component library here through the component library selection, and then we can either drag that arc into the navigator or just like this directly onto the form editor. And I'm just going to optically align it, drag it out so that it fills the background arc properly. And just sort of tweak it manually until it looks right, basically. That's a good start. Let's give it a bit of color. And then we want to change the thickness of it. Give it a refresh, make sure that it's properly displayed in the form editor. And here we can tweak it a bit more, make sure it's really centered up nicely. Yeah, I think that looks about right. Okay, let's add some round caps to the end. And then we'll drag this start value right the way back to the bottom, which, I know is at minus 180. That's going to take us all the way around to that bottom position. And yeah, let's just tweak it a little bit more here. Yeah, it looks good. Okay, and now for the end value for that arc, this we want to actually bind to the backend. In order to do this, we're actually going to use one of our logic helper items in Design Studio. So first we need to come back here to components, bring in the logic helper library so we have access to those items, and we're going to use a range mapper here to convert a percentage into the degree angle for that arc. So the range mapper we don't need to change very much. essentially we want this 0 to 100 input range, but we want to output that to 0 to 360 degrees for this value for the arc here. So we can just change the output value or the output maximum, and then we will simply bind the input to the backend object called percentage, so that the range mapper gets that backend value as its input, and for the arc endpoint we can then take the output from the range mapper. So we'll use range mapper dot output, and now all of that is connected with our backend, ready to go. And the next thing we want to do is work on the animations and the states for this little icon down here. So let's go inside, and first thing I think we want to do is we want to add an item that we're going to use as a clipping mask for animation, so we can call that mask. And our water vector graphic, that needs to be a child of that item in order that the item can mask it. And actually what we want to do is add a couple of anchors, one to the mask, one to the graphic, so they stay fixed to the bottom when we actually change the height of the mask and animate it. We're also going to add a timeline in here to do our animation with. We can leave that mostly as default. And now we can add the states that we need. And the first state we can create just for the default stage where it's filled with water and washing as normal, and the second state is this sort of spin drain state. We'll just give them some names for now. Okay, and we actually want to, in the base state, make sure that this spin item is right at the very top so that it's visible. And then the next thing we're going to do is just go through and change these visibilities of the items so that you only see the correct item in the correct state. And here I'm actually making sure that I set every visibility explicitly. So I'm checking every visible checkbox to true in the state where I want an item to be visible, and turning it to false when I do not want an item to be seen in a specific state. And once I have all of those visibilities set up for the states, I can actually create my animation. So I need to set this item to clip because this is going to be my clipping mask. And I want to move into the state where I do the animation, so into that third state. And here I'm actually going to map a timeline, and in this case I need to add an animation, so I'll add the animation. I can give that animation a name, but everything else is fine, all the defaults are fine. I'll give it a meaningful name so that I can see when it's mapped correctly to that state properly. Okay, I have to actually select it there. There we go. So now that animation should be running in that state. So the first thing I want to do is animate the rotation of this little icon. So I'm just going to set that to 0 at the beginning, create a keyframe here with a value of 0, go all the way to the end, and then create a keyframe with a value of 360. So the icon does one full rotation on that timeline. And then for the mask, I just want to animate the height. So we'll start here with everything visible. And then all the way at the end, I'm just going to drag that height of the mask down. And as you see, it covers up or uncovers the artwork as it goes up. So now when I scrub the playhead, you'll see that water draining effect while the icon is spinning. Okay, we want to make sure that this is the default state that's used, so we'll just use the little action icon indicator to set that state to default. So this is always the state that it will load with. And we also need to use the backend data here, so we'll import the backend library once more. And once we have access to those values from the backend, we can set the when conditions for our states. So we can tell this component under which circumstances it should be in which state. I think the first one we want to do is this one here. So it's our backend object again. And water active for this state. And the other state would be the opposite. So not backend object, water active. Okay, so this component's set up properly as well now. All of our when conditions are set. Let's just rename these to something a little bit more meaningful. I think washing and draining is a better name for these states. Now with that done, everything in this component is ready. We can go back and have a look at that in the main file and see that it's in that correct default state, and everything should be now ready to go. So let's run it in the live preview. Okay, and we can see that everything is working. The data and the animations don't quite look correct yet, but we're going to pass this back to Thomas, who will integrate this back into the real backend and actually improve that data and timing so that everything looks correct. And to do that, we can actually use the Git tools inside Design Studio. Very easy because we are in the Git repository already, but we can just come up into the top file menu. Up here. We want to make a commit first. So we're simply going to select everything that we've done, add a short message to say what it is that we did. Make that commit. And then also up here in the top menu, we want to push that to the remote repository. And once that's pushed, we'll get this message here that says everything worked. And now Thomas has access to all of our design files. He can pull that down, integrate it into the real backend. And for that step, I'm going to pass back over to Thomas. So thanks very much, and speak to you all soon.
Thank you, Brooke. Now it's time to integrate the UI created by Brooke back into our C++ application. And for that, I just pull in his changes using Git. Now I've done this, and you can see the files that were added, the QML files and the assets from the PNGs. And the next step is now I have a short look at this project in QDesign Studio. I mean, there are no surprises. QDesign Studio is now updating. The project manager was just updating, and I open the main file. And yeah, there are no surprises. It's the same project that Brooke basically left for us. But yeah, I now made myself a bit familiar with it, have a short look, how it's structured, if everything is okay. Maybe I would do small refactorings or cleanups. I can, of course, also check it in the live preview. And here you still see the QML-based mock backup running. Yeah, no surprises, just the same project that basically Brooke left for us. Okay, now I will do a few very tiny changes. Let's go to the text editor. I copy the width and height here. Also double check, yeah, it's importing the correct backend. It looks good. And I copy that in my main file. Of course, I could also overwrite the constants, but I wanted to keep this simple for the demo. And instead of my screen 01 that Brooke actually didn't touch, I add the main file here. And yeah, now if we have basically everything done here, Brooke also could have done it, but he left it for me. And now I go back to QDesign Studio and we reload the file. The code model is complaining because main file is not part of the QRC file yet. So you have to add it to the QRC file. So we'll add the files here. Sorry if you cannot see the dialog right now. That's a limitation of the screen capturing software. But this is just the standard add files dialog. And I add the QML files from Brooke. And now I also add the assets, right, the PNGs. There's no magic about it. They're already in the correct folder. Everything is fine from that perspective. And if I press compile now, they also show up here. Everything is now set up correctly and we can run the project. And now we run Brooke's UI with the C++ backend. Yeah, you can see that here. The time is now actually live updating. The backend logic is a bit different from behaving from the mockend backend, but it's the same API, so it just works. The animation is not really tied to the backend, right? It's under full control from Brooke and the UI designer. It's just the state changes. Now I can do a bit of cleanup. I have to, for example, remove the screen 01 file because we don't use it. And now my job would be to continue working on the C++ backend. And I will just do that by just changing this number. So we make it a bit slower, maybe even a bit more slower, so it's more obvious that there was a change. And yeah, that would be now my main work as a developer, right? Really fleshing out the C++ backend, probably supporting Brooke a bit, maybe writing a few custom components to him or give advice. But most of my work would be on the C++ backend. And now you see the application running again. And yeah, no surprises. It's just a bit slower now. And yeah, I could now maybe write a simulator, test it on the real hardware, trigger corner cases that we didn't think up until this point of. I mean, this is a very, very simple example, of course, for the purpose of this demo. And with that, I want to say thank you. And yeah, it's now time for questions and answers. And yeah, let's start with those.